Live from Sean's basement.
Hey, live from Sean's basement, as Chris says. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Green Room's live stream on a Monday night. So today I'm joined by the incredibly hardworking and successful actor, voiceover.
Incredibly hardworking and susceptible actor, I think.
And author. He'll take anything I say. Chris Agos. He just recently came out with it's the 4th edition, right, of the book Acting in Chicago.
Fourth. Yes.
Which, if you don't have that book, it is, and you're in the Chicago market or looking to be in the Chicago market, is definitely the book to read. I mean, any talent agent in town or anybody casting or anybody in the industry would recommend that as the book to read to learn the business side of things, to creating a sustainable career here. He's written other books as well. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to talk about those too. But everybody who's joining us on YouTube, the chat is open. We'll be taking questions, but you might want to wait until, about 10 minutes have passed before you start typing in your questions, because it's just me moderating, and I start to lose track of stuff. And I oftentimes admittedly take questions from the bottom of the list rather than from the top of the list. And we're also excited that Chris is going to be joining us as a regular ongoing host in our membership group, The Practice Too. And we are joined on this call, although they're invisible to the people on YouTube. We're joined on this call by some of the people from The Practice. And after the YouTube live stream is over, we're going to break out into a separate little group where they can talk to Chris with their cameras on. So if you are in The Practice and you're on this call, I would say just save your questions for later so we can get to the YouTube questions during the first part of the meeting. Anybody who's interested in The Practice Too, we're also doing a special promotion where if you sign up in the month of May, we will send you a free copy of Chris's book, Acting in Chicago. So check that out. And lastly, before we start the questions and the conversation, YouTube makes me get 5 subscribers before we can even talk. I'm just kidding. Hit like and subscribe if you would, because that does always help out. So
I was kind of falling for that, actually. I was like, really? They make you get 5 subscribers?
Yeah, they said
that's a good trick. I gotta do that maybe.
So Chris, 4th edition. Holy cow. I remember when the book came out and I got it right away. What goes into a new edition, and how, when was the first one out? When did you first put out the first book?
Yeah, I think I started writing the first one in 2008, finished it up in 2009 because we had twins during the middle of that process. And then publication date was in 2010. So the first one's been out. It came out over, like 13 years ago now. Seems like it was yesterday, but yeah, it's been a long time.
But you're on top of it every 3 years or so, where you have to do new rewrites and everything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really have like a set schedule, but it does seem like the business changes enough over the course of 3 or 4 years that it requires an update. The previous one was a pretty hefty update, and this was a pretty good one too. The book grew by like 60 pages or something, and wow. There was just so much new information and more relevant information, like self-taping is a much more important part of our whole, profession now than it was back when the 3rd edition was out. So there was a little mention of it there, but there's like an entire chapter devoted to it in the 4th edition. So what goes into a new edition is basically everything comes out that isn't really true or relevant anymore. And then everything that kind of replaces that information goes in. So the book can be as current as possible.
Got it. And for those of you who don't know Chris outside of the book, Chris was an actor even back when I was in casting, and I remember Chris as one of the go-to actors. And in the world of casting, we always talk about, oh, so and so or so and so's booking all the time, and it really winds up being the situation where, like, why do they book all the time? Why do they book all the time? And it's always just fundamentals, just fundamentally really, really wonderfully real and creative at the same time. You have an interesting pathway that I think a lot of actors, start out on, where you didn't go to college for acting. You were in college, but you were going for being a doctor, right?
Yeah, I was on my way to medical school, and that got detoured. I detoured acting
by you
on the way to medical school.
Because you decided to, yeah.
Because the two are so similar,
yes.
It just was a logical choice.
I'm right there with you. I was in college for, well, I did do a double major, but I was molecular biology and acting at the same time. So
Sure. Molecular
that
bio.
the key to an acting career is
Is a science degree.
100%.
Exactly.
So did you take any classes in college, or how did you get started? What was your pathway into the business?
So when you apply to medical school, and I'm sure you know this, part of the process is you have to take something called the Medical College Admissions Test. And it's like one of these giant standardized tests that suck the life right out of you. It's like a couple of days long and it's a big deal. So I was studying for that and I had a lot of heavy labs and math and science classes and stuff. And I just got tired. Like I just needed a break. I needed something different other than looking at charts and graphs and numbers and everything. So in the campus newspaper, I'm dating myself a little bit here, but in the campus newspaper, there was an ad, and it was an ad for private voiceover lessons. And so I was like, well, that's sufficiently different than what I'm used to doing. That sounds kind of fun. Maybe I'll go do that, on a Monday afternoon and just to have a little bit of a break. And back then there was like one person in town. I went to school at DePaul. And so I was at the Lincoln Park campus, and there was like nobody in town that was teaching that except for this one guy. His name was Ray Van Steen, and he's still with us. I don't think he's in Chicago anymore, but he, old radio guy, they call him Radio Ray. Okay. And I just went and I visited him. After kind of like humming and hawing about it for a long time, I was just nervous to go. And I really, really stunk, but I really, really liked it. And so I was like, I was always dropping questions to him. I was always like, can you make money at this? Like, do people like build careers doing this? Or is this like a fun side thing? Do I have to do radio? Because back then that was kind of like, if you had a decent voice, everybody did radio. Right. And he was like, no, there's a lot of stuff way beyond radio. And, I'll show you what it all is if you want to see it. And so I took like 10 lessons with him or something. And we recorded my first demo, which if you're not familiar with the voiceover, a demo is about a minute's worth of audio that kind of shows what you have to offer. Right. And it was just god awful, but I just had so much fun. And I was like, if this is a real thing that I can do, then maybe I'll just try this, because I was like 22 or 23. I had no financial responsibility. I was like, if I crash and burn at this, I can always just go back to school. So that's how I got started. And voiceover led me to like on camera, which led me to all the other things that we do in Chicago. And I just kind of never looked back. Yeah, that's how I got in.
That's interesting. I started in the theater world, and then when I got into the on-camera stuff, I got intrigued in voiceover, and I wound up having a similar experience with the voiceover world, where I was like, you know what? I don't know anybody that's doing this, but I saw this ad in Perform Inc., the newspaper thing. And
the newspaper.
I went over and took that voiceover class, and one thing that really sparked me was that we were doing these voiceovers, and then I would watch the engineer, and I would watch them take two different things, cut it together, and then take the little digital pencil and complete the waveform. And I was just like blown away by how that technology worked at that time. I'm like, this is fascinating. I want to be the voice so I can watch them just tweak stuff and change it. That's fantastic. So just a question. You mentioned that your first demo was just awful. Did you think that at the time?
No.
So you didn't. Oh, so you were like, oh, this is great. This is fun. Because let's go through that in our early times of like, what am I doing? Is this good? Is this bad? I'm not sure. But I still have to take that next step forward. So where was your mind at when you got your first demo back?
I mean, when I got my first demo, when I heard it, I was like blown away. It was just so, first I had to get over that thing that a lot of people have to get over, which is just hearing their own voice on tape, right? Like sometimes people are just like, I don't sound like that. Like that's not me. And it kind of catches them off guard, and then you have to get used to that. But then when I heard the first demo, I was like, I can't believe like they made me sound like I know what I'm doing. And I really didn't know what I was doing, but it was impressive. I was impressed by that. And
Yeah.
I tell everybody, even when I work with people today who are new to the business, I'm like, look, you're going to love your first demo for like 6 months. And then, you're just going to realize, oh, wow, I could have done that better. I probably am a little stronger here in this kind of read, and that edit could be tighter and all of that. Right. So as you get a little bit more accomplished and a little bit more familiar with your own skill set, I think you want to put out there the best thing that you can put out there. So I wound up redoing my first demo after like a year. And because I was like, I know that I sound like a beginner in the first one, and I don't want to sound like that anymore. I don't sound like that now. So I'm going to do an update. And for a while there, I was, updating demos every year, which was really expensive because back then, like you had to pay the guy to, like he had the reel-to-reel tape and he would use the razor blade and cut it in the middle and like throw the section over his head and tape it together and stuff. And that was like hundreds of dollars an hour, to pay for that. But it always paid off. It was always an investment that paid off.
Yeah, the prices of those. I mean, I think my first demo was like $3,000 for the demo and $3,000 for this like graphic design of this terrible font of my name, which is just like.
Do you remember the J cards? Like
Yes.
we used to hand
God,
them
I
out
still have some of the cassette tapes.
cassettes, right? And like I learned the term J card because like the insert that goes into the cover of the tape is a shape like a J, and you had to like go to a printer and have that folded in a certain way and cut it and sort. It was such a hassle. It was like way different than it is now.
But I to keep that healthy, I think it's good to recognize that in hindsight, I mean, it's a quick learning curve, and as long as you keep going up on that learning curve, you're really solid. Because your first demo is at the moment great, and in hindsight, it was terrible, but it was really good because it was the first step to this incredibly fruitful career that if you didn't take that first step, it wouldn't have all fallen into place like that. So
yeah. I mean, you definitely have to start. That's the thing. It's like people can talk themselves out of starting all they want, but I mean, in the end, you just have to go, and you have to be willing to not sound as good as you maybe want to down the road. So
I just had a conversation. I don't know if she's on here right now, but a wonderful comedian and great writer. We were just discussing writing a project, and she's like, yeah, it's tough. And I said, it's only tough if you try to write something good. Just make sure you try to write something mediocre, and you'll take the next step forward.
And that's super easy. People do that every day.
Yeah. So one big theme of your book, which I wholeheartedly believe in the city of Chicago especially, is diversifying your opportunities as an actor. And I think you take a really nice approach on that. And I think you identify 7 different ways that actors can make money in Chicago. Tell me a little bit about that, like where you see the different pools of opportunity and how you found yourself juggling that earlier on in your career.
Yeah. Well, I think that I found all these things by accident. I mean, I really do. And maybe by accident is not really the right term, but I kind of stumbled into them. I started out just wanting to be a voiceover guy. And then somebody was kind enough to ask me, do you do on-camera acting? And I literally asked her, I was like, what's that? Like, and so she handed me a brochure and she's like, here, go take this class. And, so I did. And it just happened to turn out that I kind of felt at home there as well. It was a commercials class. And so I learned very early on that Chicago, being a smaller market than New York or Los Angeles, really meant that we didn't have like a high concentration of any one particular type of work. There are, of course, exceptions to every rule, right? So there are definitely people in Chicago who, just do voiceover. That's all they do, or they just do prints. There are models that just stick with print. But for the rest of us, what you really tend to see are actors that put together a career doing, having multiple skill sets and working in multiple disciplines. And I just found that out because I just kept going. I just went from voiceover to on-camera commercials. And then I found out about these things called industrials, which are kind of like commercials, but they can be longer and they're not necessarily always promoting something. And sometimes you're teaching something. And there are tools with, inside of that, like Ear Prompter that I picked up, somebody told me about, and that they were like, hey, you should learn this. And I was like, okay, I'll go take that class, so I was very open to everything. And it dawned on me that the more I could do, the more I could kind of cobble together a career, and that would pay for me to stay in the business.
Yeah.
Because the business is not always kind to us. The way we envision our career unfolding is not always how it turns out. We have to make money in order to stay focused on that big win that we want, that series regular or that film job or whatever, wherever we want to go. We have to stay in the business to get there.
Yeah.
And so the idea of diversification simply means don't put everything in one basket. Don't rely on one sole source of income for an acting career. And so I kind of sat down and thought about it, and I was like, well, how, besides theater, right? Because Chicago is a huge theater town, and you can spend a lot of time on stage doing shows, and more power to you. I love doing theater. It's a big time commitment, and it requires a lot of energy, and the money isn't always there, right? On the commercial side of things, the money is always there. So what I sat down and thought about was like, well, besides theater, how do actors in Chicago make money actually acting? And I basically came up with 7 reliable and repeatable categories of work that are pretty dependable. So you can say, okay, like that's going to be around, that's going to be something that I can take advantage of. I just need to learn how that operates. I need to learn how to be able to operate within that little ecosystem, because they all have different audiences, they all have different talent buyers, they all have different goals. Acting, it's very specific acting. It's acting for a specific use. So the 7 categories are things that everybody knows about, and then there are a few things thrown in that people probably don't know a whole lot about. So like your TV and film, that's a big category. Like that's a category everybody wants to work in, right? We all want to wind up on one of the Dick Wolf shows. Yeah. And of course, commercials is another category. We all want to, I remember when I was non-union and I was doing tons of commercials, I was like, why am I selling aluminum siding when I see other actors in cruise ship commercials, and they're like winning casino jackpots at night, and I'm, hanging gutters outside of a cold, garage on a cold winter's day. Like, this stinks, So there's different categories of commercials and different tiers within commercials, I got started in voiceover. So that's another category of work where you get to bring your acting skills, but you don't have to worry about your wardrobe or your makeup or your haircut or like anything that's going on that day. So long as you have a decent recording setup at home and a quiet environment to record in, you can put your acting skills to work in a very verbal way. So those are 3 of them. Some of the ones that are a little more obscure include things like trade shows and live events. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Sean is married. Sean, you're married to Michelle, who is a big trade show,
And she's worked on stage with Chris multiple times too. Yeah.
I mean, she got me work. She was like, I think she threw my name into the mix for something, and I wound up working with her on a couple of shows. So she's great. But that's also the kind of thing, doing a trade show is the kind of thing that you probably don't grow up fantasizing about, right? You don't grow up, you grow up and you picture yourself, well, I'm going to be in the next, Superman movie or whatever, but you don't say, well, I'm going to be the next spokesperson for this tech company.
Yeah.
So that's a category of work that may not be super glamorous, and it may not be the thing that you've always wanted to do, but it requires a certain set of skills that you may have. And it also pays really well. So, why not learn about that and be open to that kind of work? So just things like that. There's like all these little corners of the business. And if you're open to all of them and participating in all of them, then you can smooth your path through the business, I think.
Definitely. Yeah. And it seems to ebb and flow. I mean, like trade shows during this whole pandemic thing for our family just like dipped incredibly when
it went away.
completely stopped.
Yeah,
And
it went
but we're
away.
really happy that they've blossomed back in big full force right now, as we're like,
Right.
oh, looking at this writer strike happening, yet trade shows are coming back in. So
Right.
yeah, having that opportunity to go into a different pile at any given time is really huge. Do you have I'm sure people ask you all the time, since like you're the guy who wrote the book, so you probably get questions from actors like, where should I start? Do you have any advice for that, or is that kind of an individual answer for what that person's
Yeah.
struggling?
I mean, it is kind of an individual answer, but I do think that it's important to get really clear about what you want, because you can't start unless you know where you want to end up. I think that's
Yeah.
just my take on it. So like, you know, um, I think actors have two parts to our job. I think the first is the craft, right? It's like the skill set. We have to know how to do what actors are called upon to do when we're called upon to do it. So you got to study that, right? So I'm always like, get your craft, lined up in such a way that it's competitive, because you do have to be competitive in this business. You have to be able to see a script and analyze it, and come to it from a point of view with an opinion and make a couple of choices and then execute, right? If you can't get through that process reliably, then you're probably not ready to work in a professional environment yet. So you got to get that first. And then the other half of our job is everything we do in pursuit of the opportunity to perform. And so those are the things like looking at all the other little corners of the business. Like, okay, I know how to act now. How can I lift those skills and translate them into commercials? Like, that's a super easy leap, I think. If you've kind of come up and you've analyzed a ton of text, and you're used to telling stories in, the stretch of an hour or two, well, you can definitely learn pretty quickly how to tell a story in 30 seconds, or less.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty easy leap. I think going into voiceover is something that you should at least explore pretty early on, just because of the fact that, there's so much opportunity in it. And the barriers to entry just have dropped to almost nothing now. Like, so if you're with an agency, if you're new and you've got a talent agent in your corner, and they probably have something, they probably have some voiceover stuff coming their way across their desk. So you may as well be included on that. So that's just another sort of tool in the toolbox.
Yeah.
So I just feel like people have to, they definitely have to know what they're doing before they kind of declare to the world that they deserve to be paid for it. I did it the other way. I was like totally clueless. I mean, I was like, okay, I'm going to go be a voice talent and I don't know anything about it, but I'm going to make me some money. I'm going to do it because I hear you can do that. Like, that was my attitude. And then I realized, oh no, you really do have to know what you're doing, because there are other people who do. So don't do what I did.
Yeah, and the pathway always seems so clear and easy in hindsight to be like, oh, this is what I did, and it was just like it was one step, and then I just took the next step, and then I went and did this, and then did this, and I think that
Yeah.
is so many people that have found a pathway in the business, but on the front end of it, when you're looking at it, you're like, which way do I turn? Something that you just said that I don't know if people caught that, but Chris said, making the transition from strong acting skills into commercials is fine if you have the ability to sit there and analyze a bunch of scripts and everything like that. And I'm like, whoa, stop there for a second, because I don't know if anybody's watched Chris's YouTube clips, but Chris is actually somebody who will sit there and watch something and analyze it. And I think that that's so important in an artist's existence, is to say, I can analyze things. It's not to say Chris is the expert. He analyzed this for me. I mean, you should go and watch his videos, but you should also do what he's doing and take the time to watch stuff and say, why is this working? And take that analytical approach of picking stuff apart for yourself as well, people who are watching out there, to see how things work. Because I think that's, I would assume that that's a huge part of where your success came from, is because you took that upon yourself from the get-go of saying, all right, I don't know how this works, but I'm going to figure out how this works. So you're actually this really active participant in finding that next step, and not
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. My attitude is if you're not familiar with what creatives are putting on the air right now, then you're not really, you're kind of operating in your own little world, right? So that's one of the reasons why I did those, voiceover analysis videos, is because like
Right.
let's take something cool that's good
Yeah,
and let's figure out the choices that were made. Let's kind of reverse engineer it,
yeah.
because voiceover is the kind of thing that will ebb and flow, like styles will come and go,
Oh, heavens.
as celebrities kind of come and go, right? Like somebody
Yeah,
becomes really popular and suddenly he or she is like the thing everybody wants to emulate. And then that, something that kind of
yeah,
runs its course and then somebody else takes over.
yeah. But I think that's a really good challenge for everybody who's watching. Ask yourself, within the last week, within the last month, have you watched a TV commercial? And it's easier online by far. Have you watched a TV commercial and then played it back and watched it again, and then played it back and watched it a third time in one sitting, just so that you watch the actual same thing 3 times or more in a row? Or do you just watch stuff pass you by and say, oh, I'm going to remember that next time, but you don't stop and rewind it and watch and say, what's going on here? How did they build this? Why did they build this? And how is the actor playing a part in this thing? Like, what are the skills that I could pull forth from this? Because I think that is such an important thing. It's so cool to
Yeah.
see, somebody doing that with the voiceover stuff online. Um, Nowadays versus when we started, what are some huge things that you've seen change that you were like, this has to go in the book? Oh, okay, this has to go in the book. As far as the actors.
Well, I mean, obviously, I think the biggest change is the emphasis on self-taping.
Yeah,
It's just I do want to take just a little bit of credit, and because I put it out there, I think it was in 2018 or something. I don't know, whatever the last edition of the book was published. I mentioned it and I was like, I don't think this is going anywhere. I think this is only going to be more important as time, goes on.
right.
And I actually had a couple of people like, come up in conversation and they'd be like, you don't think they're never gonna, they can't, why would they wanna, and it's true, especially when it comes to, commercials. Like we wouldn't have never been trusted to tape our own commercial auditions when you were in casting. I mean, oh my gosh, we
Right.
wouldn't have known anything, right? So the fact that now, like, our job has really changed, like really changed. It's not good enough just to know how to be able to break down the script and,
Yeah.
be able to make some choices. And it's not about the performance. It is also about the technical aspects of it. I'm sitting here right now in my self-tape environment, right? And I'm like looking at it and I'm going, oh yeah, where is it? Right here. I got a shadow right back here that I got to get rid of, And so I don't know. You don't have to be as like granular about it as I am, but this is now part of the discussion, whereas in the past it was not at all.
Yeah.
That's one thing. I think another thing that's really changed in my time since getting started is the emphasis on improv. Back when I got started, you stuck to the script because the script was like the Bible. It was not to be messed with because it had gone through so many layers of approval and legal and all that. And that's still true today. But really, especially if we're talking about commercials, a lot of creatives are like, no, give me ideas. I want to, I have an idea, but it's a team effort. If you come up with something really good, it might wind up in the final edit. So, I would never call myself an improv guy at all. I'm not an improviser. It's just not a strong suit of mine. And I'm okay with that. It's not a big deal. But when I was learning voiceover way, way, way long time ago, I took an improv class and it totally changed my reads because I was like in this rut of thinking about things the same way. And then I took this improv class and it totally like opened up the options, right? I was like, oh, I can do this and this is acceptable. And, it was very freeing. And so my reads changed, and it made me a better voice talent for sure.
Absolutely.
And, that's only become more true with commercials. And there's still some areas of work where you don't want to improvise. You just don't. You don't do it in industrials. You really don't do it on the set of a TV show unless you're asked to.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's a more important skill today than it ever has been. It's more in demand than it ever was before.
Yeah, and both those arenas, certainly came. I think Jack Black, I listened to him in an interview. I don't know what it was, maybe 8 years ago or so. And he said, if you want to be an actor in today's day and age, you really, he says, I'm sorry, but you need to be a writer too, which in my book, that means improvisation. Improvisation is writing on the fly. And the more that you've got the skills of writing means the more comfortable you are with structure, so that the stuff that you do throw out there off the cuff isn't going to knock the train completely off the tracks.
Right.
And I thought I fully agreed with him when I heard him say that. I was like, it sucks. I'm sorry. I know everybody wants acting just to be acting, but there was a step forward, especially in the commercial business, where it becomes required. And now, this whole technology thing, you don't have to be this technology guru. You don't have to be the best person in the world. But I think instead of utterly resisting it, find what little bits of joy you can. And if that is, Chris filling in a little bit of shadow or kicking a little bit more backlight, that's kind of fine tuning stuff to a nth degree, but that can be fun, and it can be inspiring, and it can make you want to do your next self-tape. Or if it's just, I'm going to pay a little bit more attention to my framing and I'm going to get that a little bit better. If that's all you need to do, that's great. You're at least putting the attention into it. As an actor, you need to know how to use Gmail or whatever email you use, perhaps as much as you need to use a smartphone camera. So that does definitely comes into play. Where are we at? So it was the 33. So LA versus Chicago. How is the business different? I know you've got a little section in the book. Is the section in the new book, is there one about moving to LA instead of from in LA to Chicago?
Yes. So there is, as you know, there are a lot of people in Chicago who think about moving to LA. And so I definitely wanted to address that because I did it. And so, there's a pretty hefty chapter in the book about that. So how is it different? Well, there are a lot of practical differences, and there are also a lot of mindset differences. From a practical standpoint, LA is the cost of living here is substantially higher than Chicago. So, but putting that aside, what's interesting about people who reach out to me and ask about hey, what should I know about living or moving to Los Angeles? Often what they ask about is geography. They're like, it's so big, where do I land? And there are a bunch of different areas to land in. So there are all these sort of lifestyle choices that you can make, and things from a practical standpoint, do you, try to get a place that, if you're a single person, are you going to get your own place? Are you going to double or triple up? If you're a family, do you have little kids? You have to worry about schools, and it can kind of get to be sort of a big issue. So the chapter in the book is my effort at trying to sort of condense it all and break it all down and make it organized and everything. But just from a profession standpoint, the business out here in LA is much more of a business than it is in Chicago. By that, I mean that the emphasis is much more on, how do I put this? What can we do together, right? It's I've met you, I like you, but how can we work together? There's a lot of that. And, in Chicago, I really didn't find that as much. It was hey, I met you, I like you, we're friends now. Yeah. And we're going to go hang out.
I will support you, and let's see what comes of the future. But it's such a supportive environment. It's such a wonderful place. Yeah.
Completely. It's a in Chicago, I think I put this in the book. Chicago is you're just going to meet a lot of people who just want you to do well, and they don't want anything in return for that. Like it's a Midwestern thing, right? Like we're just all in this together. And if one of us does well, the entire community gets lifted a little bit for that. And
Yep.
it's great, so that environment, I have not found that environment in Los Angeles. And the other thing that I noticed about LA is that it took me, and, just anecdotally talking to some other people, this is also true for them. It takes you a little bit longer to find your people out here. There's a ton of people to find, but to find the group that you really feel like you are really part of and who kind of speak your language and have your value system, and that's a harder lift, a heavier lift here.
Sure.
So a lot of it has to do with like where you study, right? And there are different schools that follow different techniques and have different emphasis and everything. And you can get involved with a school, and many schools try to foster a sense of community. But if you don't really feel like you belong there, then you're like, I kind of tried it and it didn't work.
Yeah.
So you kind of bounce from place to place. There's a lot of bouncing around that happens here.
Right. Yeah. Like in Chicago, it just seems like everybody takes from all of the schools. Like they'll study with us, they'll study at other places, and
Totally.
and that's
Yeah. But in
like,
LA, man, people stay put for like years.
Yeah.
They'll stay put forever.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of interesting. So yeah, it's just different. It's just different.
Yeah, and you did one of the more difficult things, one of the more daunting things, is that you moved out there with kids. So that was navigating things. But for people who don't know, Cliff is, one of his kids is also an extremely successful voiceover actor, which can certainly help. But I know we had talked a little bit. Did you put a new chapter? I'm sorry, I read the older version.
That's okay.
Is there a chapter about kids in the business
There
here?
is.
Are you coming out with a whole book about that?
There is. So chapter 17 is titled Kids in the Business in the new edition of Acting in Chicago. But I may as well announce this now. I mean, I didn't intend to. I don't have anything to show you. But yeah, the next book in the Acting in Chicago series, if you want to call it that, is Acting in Chicago for Kids and Parents. So basically, what we did is we took apart the Acting in Chicago book for adults and kept a lot of the things that are relevant for, kids and minors who are working, who are, legally allowed to work in the industry, and put in all the stuff that was specific to kids. So that book is going to be coming out probably, what month is it? What are we in? May? I'm guessing June. I think probably beginning of June is when that book is going to come out.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. I thought I read that on your website, so I thought that was already.
That's okay. It's said forthcoming for a while. So
I thought, okay. So I'm
not
reading things.
Yeah. So it's all good. But yeah, it's people have been actually asking for that for a while, and having gone through the entire thing as an adult and then going through it with our son, it was time to have for kids to have their own book.
Yeah, and our children too have like, they don't.
That's right.
Want to pursue acting, but they've done their fair share of acting jobs, and like, I think like we're doing the college fund.
It's great for college fund.
It's a different it's a bit of a different beast for kids, because they're kids. I mean, they're kids. Everybody's like always worried about that resume, that to get a town, and like if you got a 5-year-old, my response is always, they don't have any experience. They don't have any life experience. They don't have a very big vocabulary. It's okay. You can snap photos in your backyard. It's an entirely different process, and everybody in the business completely understands that. But there are things that the parents really need to know, so that you're approaching and treating the rest of the elements of the business kindly and not driving everybody crazy. And
and I also think, so in talking to people for this book, I got the sense that there are parents who really understand that this is like a profession and a professional environment that they're asking their kids to operate within, right? And with that comes all kinds of things like, kids are expected, they have the same responsibilities as adults do on a set or in a studio. They're there to do a job. It's not, it can be fun and it should be fun, but it's like
Yeah.
not entertainment for them. It's kind of work, But then there's this whole other subset of parents, I think, that want to get their kid into the business and they treat it sort of like just another soccer team or just another activity that can kind of be, can kind of come and go.
Yeah.
And so the new book tries to make the point that, there are livelihoods on the line when you make a commitment, when you book a job, and you need to show up on time, and you can't decide that the kid's having a bad day or the kid has too much homework or whatever and pull out, like that's not cool.
Yeah.
So there is a line, right? It's like we're dealing with kids, but at the same time, on the parent side, they have to understand that it is a professional environment that they want to gain access to, and it comes with responsibilities.
Yeah, totally. So I see that the clock is flying by us. So I'm going to go look at some questions here. So while I do that, I'm going to throw a link to Chris's book in the chat. If everybody doesn't have any clue what we're talking about, there's a link to his book there.
Thank you.
So there's of course. So I have to ask this question first because everybody's dying to know. Not mine, yours. What kind of camera mic are you using right now?
Oh yeah. Ordinarily,
because I'm lazy, but I've got my
dude. I am
camera 6K sitting right up there. Yeah.
I typically will have my self-tape camera is a Canon 80D, so it's an older DSLR. And I usually have Sennheiser 416 hooked up to that. Right. Yeah, just because
I leave that in the booth. I've got a cheapo thing up on the ceiling. I forget.
There you go. That works too. I just take mine out of the booth because I'm too cheap to spend $100 on the cheapo one. So I'm like, I got it. I'll just move it.
This is from the studio before COVID. We shut down one of the studios
cool. Yeah. So that's what I would do if this were an audition. This is not an audition. So I'm working on a MacBook Pro that you're seeing, just a regular laptop, nothing fancy.
Cool. Good. Just good lighting.
Yeah. I got a couple of I got 1, 2, 3, 4 lights going right now. Yep. So, and I still think I need another one for right over here.
I know. I drive everybody crazy all the time when I'm like, I don't like the way ring lights look.
If I don't move, you don't notice it, but if I move, look at that.
Well, the fix to that is always just slightly farther from the backdrop, but sometimes
I know I could have moved everything.
Doesn't work. Yeah, sometimes it just doesn't work. So since we were talking about improv, Natty asks, how do you feel about improvisers not being compensated for their creative contributions to the final form of a script? And it definitely depends upon what kind of script and material it is, commercial versus TV versus, and there are in some contracts, depending, and we're talking union stuff, in some of the contracts, there is compensation written in there if it's a requirement.
Right. So I get kind of, as I get older, I get saltier on stuff like this. And I remember when we were auditioning and for commercials and improv was becoming more and more important. And I would leave these audition rooms and I would be like, I just wrote this dude's scripts for him, and of course I would not get the booking. And so there's a part of me, I have a story about a Walmart commercial that I could tell you, maybe some other time, but it's one of those things that, I almost see it as one of those things that is just another thing that has sort of encroached on the business. Like, I want to be positive about it. And I want to understand that, it's the way kind of the world has moved, right? But I do feel like if we materially change the concept or the ideas in the commercial, I think there should be some compensation for that. So I don't know. I don't, like I said, I'm not a heavy improviser. And so I'm not out there doing that a whole lot, but there have definitely been times, when I've walked out of that room and I'm like, yeah, that was way better than what they had on the page. And I bet it's used, And I don't know what to do with that. I'm like, I like, we're here to serve, right? I fully try to embrace that mentality. Acting is a service business, right? Yeah. So if we can help get their job done for their client and their client thinks they're rock stars, great. That means they're just going to continue to produce more. And you got to figure that eventually that's going to come our way, right?
Yeah.
But there's a little part of me that's like, you happy I did your job for you? You know?
Sure. Absolutely. So
I don't know.
So I have pretty strong opinions on the whole thing too. And I think it's a super valid question. From casting, when I was casting, I would say, because I think that the concern is always, oh my gosh, if I audition for your script and I improvise in the audition, you're going to take my material and go make your commercial with it and not cast me. Did I ever see that happen? Maybe a few times, but I would say overwhelmingly, probably 95% of the time, 99% of the time, if you did the improvisation and they wanted to put it in the script, they're going to book you and put it in it. I do remember as an actor once, I booked a commercial, I showed up on set, and a lot of times, you know, you'll have your little back pocket full of improvisations or pre-written material, if you will. And that oftentimes gives you the freedom to improvise on the spot and truly spontaneously create. Though when the bills are getting paid by the commercial people, neither one of those is more valuable than the other. You still get, you know, that $50,000 for the commercial if it was pre-written or if it was spontaneously improvised. Nobody's even going to know the purity of it. But one of the extras came up to me after I threw out an improvisation on set. And he said, that line that they're having you do, that was mine. That was from my audition. And I was like, oh, that's really funny. That's really great. You know, I was trying to be as generous as possible. And I didn't want to say, I know I've been doing this for a while. I did the same improv in my audition, and I would be willing to bet you that 10 other people did the same improv because it's a really nice piece of low-hanging fruit in there. But
I have done improv and it has gotten me it's gotten me the job, and we didn't, you know, use it in the end. So that's happened as well. So like, I don't know, you just kind of like take it as it comes and you figure that in the end, everything's going to work itself out. You know,
it does work. It does. And I'm, you know, as coming from being primarily a theater trained actor, I would pretty comfortably say I've made my living improvising, not on stage as an improviser, but
right.
Booking commercials is pretty much how I've made a living all these years. And if it goes right back to it, I would say, well, why do I improvise? Why do I act? And both the same question, both the same answer, because it's fun. And I love doing commercials. Sometimes I love doing commercials more than TV shows, primarily because being on set and just screwing off the whole time is fun.
It's a good way to spend a day.
So if they wind up embracing that and paying for it, I get it. Yes, we wind up giving them creative stuff, but it's either you can see it as a good thing or a bad thing, that it's the state of the fair in the industry, and embrace it and roll with it, or push back on it and
be salty about it.
But I feel it. I feel it. It's a solid, super valid question.
Yeah.
Samantha has a degree in statistics, another science geek. Good job.
Nice.
Done. What do you recommend for people who are feeling their on-camera demo doesn't represent them anymore? Is it better to have clips up or to remove them until we get ones that represent us more?
That's a really good question. I think all of your materials have to represent you. I don't think it serves anybody if, you know, if your clips are 20 years old and everybody can tell, right? So if you've gone through some kind of professional development or some kind of personal change and you know, it's pretty obvious, I think that's probably a sign that you should work on getting clips that match up with what you bring into the room now, or not into the room anymore, but what you bring to the table, what you bring to the party now. I think that's really important.
Yeah. Let me grab something here. Copy link. I've got a question from Pete, former radio guy looking to get back into voiceovers. What's the best way to source quality equipment and set up a home studio? I go back to cut and splice days. Pete, I'm going to drop something in the chat. We've actually got a free course on that on our online platform. So that's obviously a large question, because it goes into like how much money do you want to spend? What's your situation like right now? And Chris throwing out the 416 that's hanging off of his ceiling right now is probably not where you want to start
Don't
with
buy a
a
416.
$1,000 plus microphone.
No, I would say though, the short answer to your question is, I wrote a book called The Voiceover Startup Guide.
That's right. Yes. And we were going to talk about that. Yes.
Yeah. And so so if you want to look that up on Amazon, that literally is about 120 pages answering the question that you just asked, with equipment recommendations and all that stuff. So
absolutely. And then somebody had a similar question. I submitted to 4 Chicago talent agents. One of them rejected me because my audio is not professional. I used a Blue Yeti mic with a pop filter. So if that was rejected because the audio quality wasn't professional, is that just the microphone, or are there other things that come into play? I have thoughts about the Blue Yeti mic.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak to the quality or lack of with that product. I've never used that product.
People use it. I've heard some noise from it in some people's setups, but people have booked with it and have recorded jobs with it. So,
I mean, I think probably, the microphone is just one link in the chain. And I think it might be that, maybe they were picking something up in your ambient noise or something. Maybe you were recording in a space that wasn't super dead. Or maybe there was, those USB cables are notorious for like producing hiss and like low level hiss. So it could be any number of things.
Yeah, it absolutely. A lot of times, your room is more important than anything. Doesn't mean you need to have a voice booth. It just means, are you paying attention to the treatments of the room for the echo? And then my second guess would be, how far are you from the microphone?
Yeah, it could be too. Like if you're right on top of it, that's definitely going to be funky.
Nick asked a question. No, not. I'm sorry. 333. Any commercial writers under WGA? There might be, but they're not struck. Commercials totally different than the WGA strike.
Totally different. So animation too. You can still work in animation.
When do you know when it's time to get another agent? And I'll jump back into the practice. People, don't worry. I've got you on the radar. I'm just trying to get through some of these questions on the YouTube thing.
Yeah. When do you know when it's time to get a different agent? Well, it's when it becomes a one-way street. When you're doing everything that you can, and you're trained and you're ready and you're available and you're easy to work with, and your materials are current and everything, you're doing everything that you're supposed to be doing, and there's virtually no response or very little response from the other side. My time frame, everybody's time frame is different, but I usually give a relationship about 18 months to kind of work itself out, right? And if you are basically unsatisfied during that first 18 months, chances are there's nothing that's going to change, and you should probably end that relationship and look somewhere else.
Yeah.
My thought on that.
What are your thoughts on leaning into user-generated content as an additional means of income for actors, like YouTube channels and stuff like that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. Content, there's like an endless appetite for content, right? So do you want to like go and write your own web series now? I guess. Is it going to land like maybe it would have 10 years ago? Probably not. But, if you want to start a YouTube channel, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think what sometimes the lines can get blurred in terms of like, well, do I want to, if I'm going to be myself on YouTube, but I want to play characters on TV, how helpful is the whole YouTube thing? I don't really know if I have a strong feeling about that one way or the other, but I guess I would sum up. I'm talking in circles because I really don't have an answer. Here's my answer. Be very thoughtful about what you're going to put out on YouTube or anywhere else. And just know that it's going to live there forever and it will always be available. Yeah. So my wife, her mom, when she was growing up, had this saying. She was like, don't ever do anything that you don't want to read about in the paper. And I think if you replace the paper with the internet, like that's still really good advice today. So just be very careful about whatever content you put out because it's never going to go away.
Yeah. And then Shannon had one last question. What are your tips for learning to just trust your facial expressions? Are doing what you think they are without needing to rewatch and analyze every self-tape take. So what do you do to trust that your facial expressions are doing what you think they're doing?
I don't think about my facial expressions ever. So what I would do is I would change your focus and I would focus on telling the story that is on the page. Make sure you're telling the story on the page. Your facial expressions will be just fine.
And Shannon, Chris is somebody who I would say came to the business with a solid visual vocabulary. And some people don't. Some people don't communicate with this vocabulary as well as others, for sure. If you're concerned and if you find that you're just not reading the way, you're not getting the point across when you're getting the point across, and facial expressions oftentimes wind up being in subtext. So if you're leaning in under the subtext, that oftentimes solves the problem. But my answer would be, if your question is regarding self-tapes that you're submitting for auditions, the answer is study that stuff and tinker with that stuff and play with that stuff when nothing matters. So put the practice time into your acting so that it becomes really good. It's like, how do I drive the car and trust that I know which way I'm turning or whatever? How do I back up and steer a trailer, which is totally messing with my mind because I have to steer the steering wheel in the opposite direction. Do it a bunch of times in a really safe environment, and study that so that you don't have to think about it. Exactly. You want to get to the place where Chris is at, where he's like, I don't think about it anymore. Because
I totally rewatch my self-tapes though. Like I watch them and I want to make sure that everything is, looking good before I send it out. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I oftentimes do that pretty quickly. I'll record 2 or 3 takes and then watch back for feedback.
Right. That's what I do too.
Yeah. Yep. Cool. All righty. I know we're running really long here. So thank you everybody out there in YouTube world. This has been fantastic. People in practice, stick around. If anybody's interested in the practice or the free copy of Chris's book, if you join the practice in the month of May, that's there in the chat. And as always, if you've got thoughts for any webinars that you want to see, people you want to talk to, shoot me an email, Sean@thegreenroomstudio.tv. And you are all fantastic out there. Thanks for joining us.
See you guys.
All right, so I'm ending the stream and then we're going to let everybody in. So we have about a half an hour here to chat.